Hi, folks. Welcome to another episode of the Boardroom Blueprint. Here we're talking with Darrell once again. Hey, Darrell.
How you doing?
Not too bad. How are you?
I am hanging right in here, sir. Just eager to get going on this new podcast now that the summer's over.
The summer's over, and we're in episode 14. Hard to believe. Anyway, today we are going to talk about what happens when a board goes bad, when things go wrong and they get in trouble, right?
Yes, and it happens invariably. It's going to happen. It's a risk management function that has gone awry, and part of the risk management function is good governance.
Absolutely. So let's talk about what happens when things go wrong, because that's what everyone wants to hear about.
Well, I can give you some stories here, and let's just get right into this. Risk management is a function of good governance, and good governance is a function of risk management. They're synonymous with one another. You can't have one without the other. And what good governance does, it protects the board, it protects the organization, and it protects everybody that's associated with the organization, from volunteers to board members to employees, and even to donors who are very, very vested into your organization. So you need to have pieces in place to ensure that the board is protected. And anybody that's associated with an organization today want to ensure that that organization is responsible, they're accountable, and they're reputable. If not, they're not going to be a part of that organization, or if they are a part of the organization today, they may not be for very much longer. And I've seen incidents, all kinds of things that have happened where board members and employees and donors have left just because of their concern about the reputation of the organization. So you need to have the risk piece in place to make sure that good governance practices are happening, and they avoid any potential negative situations that happen. Because undoubtedly, when a negative situation happens, it hits the media. And you know what happens when it hits the media. Everybody knows, and then your reputation is irreparably damaged. And I've seen organizations that have ceased to exist as a result. I've seen board members that have resigned. I've seen executive directors that have resigned, and I've seen boards that have had a very difficult time attracting people to being a volunteer or even back on the board when that happens.
So, I mean, like most of us, we're probably out sitting there going, my board's fine. We're good. Yeah. There's nothing wrong with my board. Like we can take on anything. What would you say to those guys?
I have heard that in my sessions with boards. I've heard that a lot. And it's always this adage that it doesn't happen here. It won't happen here. We're okay. But I'm going to give you some examples later on where it does happen here.
Right.
And they thought that it would never. And unfortunately and regrettably, these organizations are paying a price because they didn't put in place good governance standards, because they thought that it wasn't ever going to be an issue with them. And undoubtedly it is. If you do not have good governance in place, at some point, it's going to happen. And I've seen so many media releases over the past year or two where boards did not have good governance, and they hit the media for the wrong reasons, and it's affected their reputation. So I'm here to tell you what you need to do to avoid that. But I'm going to give you those examples, and I'm also going to talk about some statistical data that supports the need for good governance.
Right. So we're talking about good governance. What are those things that we can put in place to mitigate the risk?
Well, the very first thing you need to do is understand what your roles and responsibilities are as a board member. And there's all kinds of pieces that you need to know about that. You need to know what questions to ask. You need to know what reports you need to receive. You need to know what your priorities are. All of these kinds of things, and having the right people at the table that have board experience, all that comes into play. And then on an ongoing basis, you need to be assessing your governance. Are we doing the right things? Do we need to improve here or there? And put those pieces in place. It's a continuous process. It's not one thing and you just drop it. It's continuous. And once you do those kinds of things and you have a process in place that continuously reinforces it, then you are going to be in a much better position to either eliminate risk or significantly mitigate any significant thing happening to you, because you don't want to hit the press for the wrong reasons, that's for sure.
So what are some of these risks we're talking about?
Well, let's talk about some examples of what I have seen, and some of you may have seen in the press.
Sure.
Okay, because when you don't have good governance practices and a strong risk management strategy in place, it's not only affecting your reputation and that of your organization, but it's everybody associated with it. Your key stakeholders. Some of your key stakeholders would be your donors. If your donors are not happy or not comfortable with what you are doing, then they are going to withdraw part or all of their funding. And when their funding is withdrawn, the organization can frankly cease to exist,
Right.
depending how strong that funding is. And I've seen that happen. And the people that suffer the most when that happens are the people in the community that use the services of the organization. So every decision, every action, every oversight practice you have in place as a board, you need to keep at the forefront. I'm doing it for the people that need this service. And if you keep that at the forefront, you're going to make sure your good governance is in place. So some examples, let's just give you, some things that I have seen or read about.
Time for the horror stories?
Oh, these horror stories are interesting. And I got some statistical data that will support that this is going to happen more and more and more as we go forward. In one case, this was in the press. It was in the local paper, and it was a YMCA in a small community, medium-sized community in Ontario. And the municipality of this community provides a big funding support to this YMCA to the tune of $600,000. In this particular year, they held back that funding because, as they put it, they're concerned about the governance practices of this organization.
And that's code for something, right?
It is code. I mean, when they see that, you wonder, well, are the governance practices that they were concerned about?
Right.
You read further into the story, and the financial situation of the organization was in dire straits, and the membership was decreasing on an annualized basis. So they didn't have enough funding just from the membership dues to sustain the organization to very much longer. And the municipality said, unless you fix that, we're not going to put any money into this because
we're not putting
good money
more into a leaky boat. Like it's the ship's going down.
Absolutely. Right. And they questioned the strategic priorities, the strategic plan of the organization. So that's the big governance issue in that particular organization. They did not have a strategic plan or strategic priorities that focused on the financial situation that had been happening for years and the declining membership.
So you think by having their board more prepared, better educated, and having a plan in place, it would have saved that whole...
Absolutely. One of the things that the organization probably did not have in place, I don't know for sure, is that it did not have a governing policy around strategic plan, so that you focus on the priorities and you understand in a strategic plan your threats and your weaknesses and you address it. And they obviously didn't do that. Right. So that's the biggest weakness, and the municipality identified that. So now you have an embarrassed board, right, and an embarrassed executive director who now have to get a membership drive going, focus on their priorities around governance and what they need to do to satisfy what the municipality needs.
They're left scrambling.
Exactly. So here's a donor, if you will, the municipality, who now is holding an organization accountable, which they should,
sure,
to meeting certain standards before they give the money. Here's another example, and this happened in a province where the province developed in 2022 a program where they were going to be offering grants to any organization that deals with the Mental Health Association or anything to do with mental health, which is very commendable. So they created a nonprofit organization to deal with the applicants, the applications that come in for the grants, and then provided the funding. So this organization received $1 million in operating funds right at the start, and they went to work. In the first year, they gave out somewhere in the vicinity of 45 grants to the tune of $5.5 million. They declined 65 or 70 grants applications to the tune of $12.5 million. So as with any government-funded program, there was an assessment done by the Auditor General of this province. So the report and the findings determined that there were a lot of governance issues that weren't being managed. One of the issues was reporting. Reports of declined applications and why were not getting to the board of directors. And they had the same criteria in approval that the other ones did.
So the board never even knew about these ones.
They did not. So why was there a difference in those that were approved and those were not? This organization also had applied for increased operating funding of $500,000, and they didn't have that part in place, so that the boards could review all applications. But even to make this matter even worse is that of the 45 applications that were approved, there were several that there was a conflict of interest. 2 that they noted in the report. One was that one organization received funding where the board of directors of the organization that approved the funding or approved the grant was the founder of this organization. A huge conflict of interest.
Yeah.
And in another case, the funding was given to an organization, and there's a board member's wife was on that organization to receive the funding. And he approved.
Even newbies in board management know that's a big red flag.
Exactly. And so they did not have a conflict of interest policy or process in place to avoid those situations. And until those situations are improved upon for reporting purposes and the board gets all the information they need to get, and there's a conflict of interest policy, which is all governance related, they will not be getting any more funding.
They didn't have that. They also didn't have anything in place on how to deal with the media when it came to...
Absolutely.
Because these stories blow up. They have no idea even how to respond to them.
Exactly. And so now applicants are wondering, is this legitimate anymore?
Am I just going into a pit?
Exactly. So that's another example of what poor governance can do to you.
And just having policies in place and following them would have fixed all of this.
Absolutely. And governing policies are in place to guide the board towards good governance.
No, you're never going to get around people who are literally just trying to scam the system.
No, you're not. And, there for another podcast at another time, nonprofits get lots of scams.
Don't doubt.
As in all organizations, and it's increasing exponentially every year. So let's talk about a third one that I thought was very interesting as well. This is another Ontario nonprofit. The name was kept out of the press, which is good from a perspective of the reputation risk, although the reputation risk is going to seep out anyways.
Right.
An individual was working in the organization, and he allegedly stole over $700,000. And what he did, he was in the finance area of the organization. He created fictitious invoices, and he also had access to the account, the main account of the organization. So he was paying those fictitious invoices from the account, and the monies were going into his account of those fictitious invoices, right, because the companies were legit in terms of they were registered and the monies were going in. And so by the time they caught up to it, he had actually left the organization and has been arrested. The court case is still pending. But the governance issue there was, where were the internal controls?
Right.
Okay. And
you might not have stopped him the first time, but how could we have mitigated some of it?
Well, exactly. In internal controls, the number one thing that you need to have in place is that there is segregation of duties. So people that are handling invoices cannot handle the account.
Right.
You got to separate. You got to separate that, because this is what happens. So the internal controls were not in place, and whatever, or if they were certainly not effective. And part of the governance process is the internal control effectiveness needs to be reported on a periodic basis to the board.
Right.
And through either the executive director or through the internal auditor, if they have one. And the external auditor is the person who identified at the end. Once the person left, and they were just looking at some invoices and did some tracing and found what they found.
Right.
And now this is, like I said, this is still ongoing. So
in this case, it sounds like it would have been as simple as what most people know in the corporate world is keeping accounts payable and accounts receivable separate.
Absolutely. So again, a governing policy around internal controls, where your threshold is, how to report, all those pieces
Right.
are to guide the board.
No.
And obviously that wasn't happening.
We all want to think that everybody on our board has that board and that organization's best interest at heart.
Yes.
But as we're finding out, that's not always the case.
No, absolutely not. And then I'm going to talk about one that's high profile, has been around for a few years now, but it's important because it's in the sports community, and that had to do with Hockey Canada and what happened with the sexual assault of women over a number of years through the junior team. And
this may be the biggest breakdown of a board in North American history, almost.
You know, I'm not going to get into the specifics of what's happening here, but there's, lately most recently there's a number of hockey players that are going to be facing a court challenge on this and for allegedly being involved in this situation. But let's talk about the board's situation on this. And I read the report from an independent person or firm that oversaw what happened, and they identified that the number one issue was governance in the big picture. And they talked about governance from a standpoint of what was being reported to the board and what should have been reported to the board. So things weren't being reported, and especially around all the financial situation, let alone the significant events that were occurring, because there were alleged incidents that happened that the organization was aware of that wasn't being accurately reported to the board, allegedly. And there was financial monies that were being paid out that didn't find its way, reasoning why this monies was moving to the board. And so that was an issue. And another issue was how the board was selected, who was on the board, what the board makeup was not, did not support what they needed to do around, the situation. So there are a lot of changes that are happening. And in this particular case, that entire board and the executive director or CEO resigned. And so their reputation is irreparably damaged as well. And now this organization is trying to restore faith in their organization. Right. But, when you talk about something of that magnitude, it affects, every sports facility right across the country. So every sports organization in every province, whether it's soccer or hockey or football or baseball, whatever it is, should ensure that this doesn't happen there.
Right.
If it happened at Hockey Canada, what's happened provincially, you got to ensure that there are certain standards put in place, and that you need to have a minimum level of governance understanding, in my opinion, on these boards, regardless of whether they're you're a volunteer or not. So there's 4 examples that I wanted to cite, and these all made the press. They all affected the boards that they were on, and the organizations they were on, and the board members.
Well, going back to the Hockey Canada one for a minute, you mentioned that the executive director ended up resigning.
Yes.
If memory serves, that didn't happen right away.
No. They tried to talk about why they did these things and what was happening, and that there was a normal process. Well, nothing's normal about that process.
Right.
And it may have gone on for a while, but it didn't. It still should not have happened, and it should have been addressed years ago. It's being addressed now, and it's going to take some time for faith to be restored.
Certainly. And when it comes to a story this big, optics and PR are a big part of it.
Absolutely.
Would it have made sense that their board had policies in place on what happens when a story breaks this big? Yeah. Does the executive director just step down? Like what do you think would have helped mitigate some of this?
That's part of your business continuity.
Right.
It's a business continuity, which is strategy, which is part of your risk management strategy. What happens when a significant event happens? How do you deal with it? And how do you address it? Well, that wasn't in place.
Right. That's all part of risk management.
Absolutely. That was not in place. So reporting wasn't in place, and a number of pieces weren't in place. So there's all kinds of questions and concerns, and they're fixing it. And, it's going to take some time to fix all of it, and it's going to take some time to restore the credibility.
And we can't say that this would fix everything, but it sounds like it's as you love to say, they didn't know what they don't know. And they didn't have the education to handle these properly.
That's a great segue into some real life stats. I was reading some interesting survey stats that were done by Ernst Young and they and Deloitte was another one, and some of the stats were identical virtually, and they interviewed a number of board directors and executive directors in organizations and across the country. And what was interesting is that they determined that 77% of board members did not have prior knowledge of governance when they get on to their most recent
That's
board.
a staggering number, but I know as someone who's been on boards, first one I walked into, they asked me to go on because, hey, you're a business owner, would you mind? And I went in, I was ill prepared.
Yes. And most aren't, and they have, listen, great intentions.
Sure.
They have a passion for the organization and what it stands for. But I always say to board members, don't let poor governance obstruct your passion.
Right.
And I've seen that happen over and over again, and I just gave you a bunch of examples. These board members of all these organizations had a passion for what they were doing, or should have, but they didn't have the governance knowledge. And 77%, that's 3 in 4 board members, do not have governance knowledge. Now, those same board members, only 50% of them, since they got onto the most recent board, have decided to take some governance training. But they are only spending 10% of their time on training. That's not enough. Each organization needs to have a plan around governance development. And part of getting a board member on is to understand what is their background in governance. I don't care what your background is outside of that. If you're a doctor, you're a lawyer, you're a policeman, you're a businessman, it doesn't matter. That doesn't give you the education to be a board member just because you have that experience. You can provide expertise in any one of those areas if it comes up. But to understand governance for a board, you need to have that training, and that's separate from what they have done in their education. So
we're not talking about just how to take minutes at a board meeting here.
Absolutely not. You need to understand your responsibilities. You need to understand what information you need to receive to provide effective and accurate oversight to what's happening in the organization. In those incidents that I just spoke about, they weren't asking all the right information. They didn't have the right practices in place. So if they
sounds like one of the things, and something I know we're going to dive into in another podcast episode, is making sure the board was well enough informed. There were things they didn't even know were going on.
No, absolutely not. Exactly. And these are things that were happening, and with some of them, it's exposed by a whistleblower. Right. Usually what happens, and when that happens and it hits the media, it's very, very difficult to come back from a reputation perspective. And sometimes you never do, and the organization ceases. But I'm going to give you one last stat, which ties into the first stat when I said 3 in 4, 77% of boards members never had governance training. Well, 70% of executive directors or CEOs that were polled said that their boards do not have a good enough understanding of governance to operate effectively. So that ties right into the 77%.
Makes the other one make a whole lot of sense, doesn't it?
And an executive director, as much as they are not fully part of the board, but they are. Right. They're an indirect part of the board. They're the board's resources, but they have a responsibility. Whether they agree or not, they do. They do have a responsibility to be involved in governance development for the board. It's not talking about training the board members. It's talking about identifying what governance training all these board members need by working with the governance and ethics committee of the board, identifying which board member needs what, or do they all need the same, and putting in place a governance development plan on a continuous basis, identifying the governance training that needs to come into play, and moving forward, and having an ongoing assessment so that those areas are improving. So they know they're improving because of the training. And the best boards that I have done work with have made this an accountability measure of their executive director. They are responsible for helping and steering directors into board directors in that place. Just sitting back and just doing your operational piece, which is important, is not their only mandate.
You're missing a piece.
Yeah.
I mean, without a good board behind you, an executive director, their hands are tied.
Well, somebody said to me, one board member said to me, "So are you saying they're guilty by association?" So, well, that's one way to look at it.
That's one way to look at it.
They need to be a part of the process, a part of the improvement plan. And so when you look at these stats and you look at these examples, and there's many more examples that doesn't hit the press, but everybody in the community might still know about it. When you see these things happen, you hear all this and you see this information, and numbers don't lie, it's right there, then I'm amazed that more and more boards do not engage in governance development.
Right.
And still have the mindset that it's not going to happen here. Well, these boards said the same thing. These 4 that I just cited, it's not going to happen here, and look what's happened. So if this doesn't give you a sense of urgency and a call to action, I don't know what does, because boards need to have their governance house in order.
If it can happen to someone as big as Hockey Canada, it can happen to every board.
Absolutely, absolutely. And every board member that I talk to, I ask this question: how important is your reputation? And the obvious answer is very important. Well, then why aren't you doing something to prevent anything bad from happening?
I know you and I were talking before about the Hockey Canada thing. Like, if the last board on your resume is Hockey Canada,
you're not going to go very far in another board. Yeah, exactly.
So I think everything we're talking about kind of sums up into the nice little ball is, if you have a board, plan. Make sure you have all of your rules, policies in place. Make sure you understand what's going to happen when things go sideways. And I think one of the other ones was, get audited by a third party, because that can uncover a lot of things that are wrong.
If I could give you any bit of advice right now, is that if you have a governing policy manual, or you don't, get one, or get somebody to assess it, determine if it's effective or what else is needed. If you don't have a governance development plan, get somebody to assess that and say, this is what you need. And the way they can identify what you need is, I use this term a lot with the boards I talk to, a governance audit. I've done many governance audits where you go in and you assess the organization's governance status and their strengths and weaknesses, and you make a recommendation to put a plan in place.
It'd be safe to say that having a bad or ineffective plan is just as bad as not having one at all.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, Darrell, thanks so much for the topic today.
My pleasure.
I mean, this was a good one. We get to talk about some big fireballs that have gone out in the industries lately, and I thank you again for coming.
Okay.
If you folks have any questions for Darrell, whether it's how to deal with a failing board or problems with the board or even audits or anything like that, don't hesitate to reach out. You can find us online at d2sup.com. That's the website where we have all sorts of training from Darrell. There's a book there and all sorts of other things. Or you can catch us on YouTube with the rest of the Boardroom Blueprint. So until next time, thanks for watching.
Thank you.